By the late 1st century BCE, Rome governed the largest territorial system the Mediterranean had ever known, but it did so with political institutions designed for a small Italian city-state. The mismatch between empire and governance had become irreversible. What followed was not a sudden fall, but a prolonged institutional failure spanning more than a century, in which reform, violence, and civil war progressively dismantled the Roman Republic from within. The Roman Republic of the 2nd century BCE rested on a balance between aristocratic competition, popular assemblies, and annually elected magistrates. This system had proven effective during Rome's rise within Italy, but rapid territorial expansion after the Punic Wars fundamentally altered its social and economic foundations. Conquest brought unprecedented wealth, vast numbers of enslaved laborers, and new provincial territories governed by Roman elites with minimal oversight. Records indicate that by the mid-2nd century BCE, political power had become increasingly concentrated within a narrow senatorial aristocracy, while economic inequality widened across Italy. The earliest visible strain appeared in land ownership. Archaeological surveys in central Italy show the consolidation of small farms into large estates, or latifundia, often worked by enslaved populations captured in war. Literary sources, including Plutarch and Appian, describe the displacement of citizen farmers who had served extended military campaigns abroad. These developments reduced the number of land-owning citizens eligible for military service and voting assemblies, weakening the traditional link between property, citizenship, and political participation. In 133 BCE, these structural pressures entered open political conflict through the reforms of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. As tribune of the plebs, Tiberius proposed enforcing long-ignored limits on public landholdings and redistributing excess land to landless citizens. According to Appian's civil wars, the proposal bypassed senatorial approval, marking a procedural rupture within republican norms. The violent death of Tiberius and hundreds of his supporters represented the first instance of organized political violence within Rome itself. This event did not resolve underlying tensions. It normalized force as a political tool. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus expanded the reform agenda, introducing grain subsidies, judicial reforms, and colonial foundations. Inscriptions from colonial sites support the scale of these initiatives. Yet opposition hardened, and Gaius' death in 121 BCE further entrenched factional hostility. Interpretively, the Gracchian period demonstrates that republican mechanisms could no longer mediate disputes arising from empire-scale inequality. Reform efforts now carried existential risks for both reformers and the elite. Military transformation compounded these problems. In the late 2nd century BCE, Gaius Marius restructured recruitment practices by enrolling landless citizens into the legions. Archaeological evidence from veteran settlements across Italy and Gaul confirms the growing dependence of soldiers on state-sponsored land grants. This shift altered military loyalty. Soldiers increasingly identified their fortunes with commanding generals rather than with the Senate or assemblies. According to Sallust, this marked a decisive change in Roman political culture. The consequences became evident during the rivalry between Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla's unprecedented march on Rome in 88 BCE, confirmed by both Plutarch and Appian, shattered a core republican taboo. His subsequent dictatorship attempted to restore senatorial authority through constitutional reform, proscriptions, and legal restructuring. However, numismatic evidence and legislative records suggest these measures relied on coercion rather than consensus. Sulla's abdication did not restore stability. It demonstrated that armed force could redefine legality. By the mid-1st century BCE, political competition increasingly took place outside institutional frameworks. Pompey the Great rose through extraordinary commands granted by popular legislation, bypassing traditional magistracies. His eastern campaigns generated immense wealth, much of which flowed directly to loyal clients and veterans. Archaeologists uncovered extensive settlement activity tied to these veteran distributions, reinforcing personal networks of loyalty. At the same time, senatorial resistance to land settlement proposals blocked reintegration of soldiers, further escalating tension. Julius Caesar's career exemplifies the final breakdown of republican governance. His consulship in 59 BCE relied on populist legislation and political alliances that neutralized senatorial opposition. Caesar's Gallic campaigns, dated between 58 and 50 BCE, provided both military prestige and financial resources, documented in his own Commentarii and corroborated by Gallic archaeological sites. The Senate's attempt to curtail his command culminated in the crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE, initiating a civil war that no republican mechanism could prevent. Caesar's dictatorship concentrated authority in unprecedented ways. He held multiple magistracies simultaneously, reformed the calendar, expanded the Senate, and centralized decision-making. Inscriptions and coinage from this period emphasize personal authority rather than collective governance. Yet Caesar did not abolish republican institutions outright. He rendered them subordinate. His assassination in 44 BCE illustrates a critical interpretive point. Removing an individual did not restore a system already hollowed by structural decay. The aftermath confirmed this reality. The formation of the Second Triumvirate, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, was legalized through the Lex Titia, granting extraconstitutional powers for 5 years. Proscriptions followed, targeting political opponents and redistributing wealth. Cicero's execution, recorded by contemporary sources, symbolized the definitive end of senatorial independence. Archaeological evidence of confiscated properties aligns with literary accounts of systematic asset seizure. Civil war resumed between Antony and Octavian, driven by competing claims to legitimacy and control of military resources. Coinage issued by both factions reveals deliberate propaganda strategies emphasizing lineage, victory, and divine favor. The decisive confrontation at Actium in 31 BCE eliminated Antony as a rival, leaving Octavian as the sole holder of armed authority within the Roman world. By this stage, the Republic existed in name only. Interpretively, the collapse of republican governance was not caused by moral decline or individual ambition alone. It resulted from the interaction of expansion-driven inequality, militarized politics, and institutional rigidity. The Republic lacked mechanisms to integrate empire-scale administration, manage mass veteran populations, or regulate elite competition without violence. Each attempted solution intensified the very forces it sought to contain. Another key insight lies in continuity. Despite repeated crises, republican forms persisted. Assemblies met, magistracies were filled, laws were passed. However, their function changed. Power increasingly flowed through personal authority and military command rather than collective deliberation. This transformation explains why the imperial system could emerge using republican language while fundamentally altering political reality. By 27 BCE, after decades of civil conflict, Roman society no longer sought restoration of the old republic. It required stability, predictable governance, and control over military power. The concentration of authority in a single figure was no longer perceived as an innovation, but as a practical response to systemic failure. As civil conflict exhausted republican legitimacy, political authority began concentrating in a single figure. In 27 BCE, Rome did not abolish the republic. It redefined power within it. The civil wars had ended, armies stood demobilized, and republican offices continued to exist. Yet effective authority no longer rested in collective institutions. It had been carefully reorganized, redistributed, and concentrated under a single individual, through legal forms that preserved tradition while permanently altering political reality. Following his victory at Actium in 31 BCE and the consolidation of military control by 30 BCE, Octavian faced a critical problem. Rome had repeatedly rejected overt monarchy. The assassins of Julius Caesar had acted precisely to prevent the appearance of kingship. Records indicate that Octavian's success lay not in dismantling republican institutions, but in absorbing them. His solution was constitutional, gradual, and framed as restoration rather than revolution. In January 27 BCE, Octavian formally announced the return of authority to the Senate and Roman people. According to Cassius Dio, This gesture was carefully staged. The Senate, in turn, granted him the honorific title Augustus and awarded him control over key provinces containing the majority of Rome's legions. This settlement preserved republican language while transferring real power. Augustus held no single office that defined monarchy, but the accumulation of powers made him unrivaled. The first constitutional settlement established Augustus' imperium over provinces deemed unstable or militarized, including Gaul, Syria, and Hispania. Archaeological evidence from legionary bases confirms the continued concentration of troops in these regions under imperial command. Meanwhile, senatorial provinces remained nominally autonomous, governed by proconsuls without legions. Interpretively, this division ensured that military force, the ultimate arbiter of power, remained under Augustus' direct authority. In 23 BCE, a second constitutional adjustment further refined this system. Augustus resigned the annual consulship, responding to elite resentment over his monopolization of office. In exchange, he received tribunicia potestas for life. This power granted him the right to convene assemblies, propose legislation, and veto magistrates, tools traditionally associated with the tribunes of the plebs. Inscriptions and legal texts confirm that this authority extended across the Roman world, providing a civilian foundation for imperial rule. At the same time, Augustus' imperium was redefined as imperium maius, meaning it superseded that of all other governors, even within senatorial provinces. This ensured legal superiority without constant presence. According to Dio, this arrangement resolved jurisdictional ambiguity while avoiding overt autocracy. The emperor could intervene anywhere, but only when necessary. The system prioritized stability through hierarchy rather than competition. Military reform reinforced these constitutional changes. Augustus reduced the number of legions from approximately 60 to 28, standardizing service terms and establishing a permanent treasury, the aeraria militare, to fund veteran pensions. Archaeologists uncovered discharge diplomas and settlement patterns that support this institutionalization. Soldiers now owed loyalty to the state as embodied by the emperor, not to individual generals promising land through political pressure. Equally significant was the creation of the Praetorian Guard. Stationed initially outside Rome, these elite units served as both imperial protection and political insurance. Their presence symbolized a new relationship between military force and civil authority. Although republican offices continued to function, ultimate security rested with troops loyal to the emperor alone. This marked a departure from earlier norms while remaining legally unobtrusive. Provincial administration also underwent reorganization. Augustus implemented regular censuses, standardized taxation, and professionalized the governor class. Papyri from Egypt document detailed fiscal records, while inscriptions across Asia Minor reflect uniform administrative practices. These measures reduced arbitrary exploitation and increased predictability, enhancing imperial legitimacy among provincial elites. Urban transformation in Rome itself provided visible confirmation of political change. Augustus famously claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Archaeological remains of the Forum of Augustus, the Arapaces, and extensive temple restorations demonstrate the scale of investment. These projects emphasized continuity with Roman tradition while linking peace and prosperity to imperial leadership. The Arapaces, dedicated in 9 BCE, offers particularly clear ideological messaging. Reliefs depict religious ritual, senatorial participation, and dynastic continuity. Art historians note the deliberate association between Augustus' authority and traditional Roman values. The monument does not depict conquest or domination. It presents order restored through lawful governance. This visual language reinforced constitutional legitimacy without overt coercion. Coinage further disseminated imperial ideology. Numismatic evidence shows Augustus portrayed as princeps, first among equals, rather than king or dictator. Titles emphasized peace, pax, civic duty, and restoration. Coins circulated these messages across the empire, reaching populations far beyond Rome. This integration of economic and political symbolism strengthened the emperor's role as guarantor of stability. Textual evidence from the Residential Gesti Divi Augusti provides insight into how Augustus framed his own rule. Inscribed on monuments throughout the empire, the document lists offices held, benefactions granted, and wars concluded. Notably, it avoids claims of monarchy. Augustus presents himself as a servant of the state who exceeded all others in auctoritas, or moral authority, rather than formal power. Modern historians recognize this as a deliberate distinction, masking structural dominance behind republican terminology. Interpretively, Augustus' achievement lay in transforming personal supremacy into institutional permanence. Earlier strongmen had relied on emergency powers or charisma. Augustus embedded authority into offices, laws, and administrative routines that could outlast him. This shift explains why succession became possible without renewed civil war, at least initially. A second key insight concerns consent. Augustus did not rule solely through force. His policies addressed elite fears of renewed instability, provided veterans with secure settlements, and offered provinces predictable governance. Archaeological continuity across the Mediterranean during his reign supports claims of relative stability. Acceptance of imperial authority grew not from ideology alone, but from exhaustion with conflict. Religious policy further reinforced legitimacy. Augustus revived traditional priesthoods, restored temples, and assumed the role of Pontifex Maximus after 12 BCE. Inscriptions record renewed ritual observance and calendrical reforms. These actions linked political authority with divine favor, reinforcing the idea that the emperor safeguarded Rome's relationship with the gods without claiming divinity during his lifetime. Succession planning revealed both innovation and limitation. Augustus promoted members of the Julio-Claudian family, granting them visibility and commands. However, repeated premature deaths forced adjustments. By the time of his death in 14 CE, Tiberius emerged as successor through a combination of adoption, accumulated powers, and military backing. This outcome demonstrated that while the system could manage transition, it remained dependent on careful orchestration. By the end of Augustus' reign, republican institutions still existed, but their function had changed. The Senate advised, magistrates administered, and assemblies ratified, but none governed independently. Authority flowed from a central figure whose powers were legal, cumulative, and continuous. Augustus' model established the framework future emperors would inherit and test. The first imperial succession revealed the limits of inherited authority. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome faced a test it had never resolved in law: whether a system built around one individual could function when power passed to another without violence, rupture, or institutional collapse. Tiberius Claudius Nero inherited an empire stabilized by Augustus but burdened by its unresolved contradictions. Formally, the republic still existed. In practice, imperial authority rested on accumulated powers, military loyalty, and elite consent. Tiberius possessed all three, yet his accession demonstrated that legitimacy could not be assumed, even within a carefully constructed system. The transition began with deliberate hesitation. According to Tacitus in the Annals, Tiberius initially refused supreme power, citing constitutional propriety and senatorial responsibility. Modern historians widely interpret this episode not as indecision, but as political theater. By requiring the Senate to insist upon his leadership, Tiberius reaffirmed the fiction of collective authority while securing personal dominance. The process underscored a key vulnerability of the imperial system. Succession depended on performance rather than formal rule. Once established, Tiberius governed with notable administrative discipline. He retained Augustus' constitutional framework, holding tribunicia potestas and imperium meius, while avoiding the accumulation of symbolic honors. Coinage from his reign emphasizes continuity rather than innovation, reflecting a conscious effort to preserve stability. Unlike his predecessor, Tiberius showed little interest in monumental building programs or public spectacle. Fiscal policy formed a central pillar of his rule. Literary sources, including Suetonius, describe Tiberius as frugal to the point of austerity. Provincial tax records and papyri from Egypt corroborate an emphasis on regularized revenue collection rather than extraordinary levies. The imperial treasury expanded significantly during his reign, providing long-term financial security for the state. Interpretively, this restraint reflected a shift from Augustan legitimization through generosity to administrative consolidation through control. Military management remained cautious and conservative. Tiberius avoided aggressive expansion, prioritizing frontier stability over conquest. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were reinforced, while campaigns in Germania were curtailed following the disaster at Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE. Archaeological evidence from fortifications along the limes indicates systematic consolidation rather than forward expansion. This policy reduced strain on manpower and finances, reinforcing internal order. The loyalty of the legions, however, could not be taken for granted. Immediately after Augustus' death, mutinies erupted in Pannonia and Germania. Tacitus provides detailed accounts of soldiers demanding improved pay and conditions. The resolution of these revolts, through negotiation, discipline, and limited concessions, demonstrated the emperor's reliance on intermediaries such as Germanicus and Drusus. The episode revealed that imperial authority rested as much on military management as constitutional legitimacy. Provincial administration under Tiberius remained efficient and relatively stable. Governors were monitored closely, and accusations of corruption were investigated with seriousness. Inscriptions from Asia Minor and North Africa show continuity in civic life, with local elites maintaining roles within imperial frameworks. Archaeological continuity in urban centers suggests that provincial governance benefited from predictability rather than innovation. Despite administrative competence, relations with the Senate deteriorated steadily. Tiberius frequently deferred decision-making to senatorial debate, yet punished outcomes he deemed disloyal. Tacitus describes an atmosphere of suspicion in which senators struggled to interpret imperial expectations. Treason trials, maestas, increased targeting speech and perceived disloyalty rather than overt rebellion. Legal records confirm the expansion of these prosecutions during the later years of the reign. Interpretively, this tension reflects a structural problem rather than personal hostility alone. The Senate retained prestige but lacked autonomous authority. Tiberius expected cooperation without resistance, initiative without independence. This ambiguity eroded trust on both sides. Senators feared imperial reprisal, while the emperor perceived dissent as ingratitude or threat. The system encouraged caution rather than effective collaboration. The role of the Praetorian Guard became increasingly significant. Under the command of Sejanus, the Guard was centralized in Rome, marking a departure from Augustan practice. Archaeological evidence confirms the construction of permanent barracks within the city. This concentration strengthened imperial security but also altered political dynamics, embedding military power directly within the capital. Sejanus' rise illustrates the dangers inherent in delegated authority. Acting as intermediary between emperor and senate, he accumulated influence over appointments, trials, and access to the emperor. Tacitus and Dio describe his manipulation of treason accusations to eliminate rivals. The extent of his power became apparent only after his abrupt execution in 31 CE, following revelations of conspiracy. This episode exposed how imperial governance could be destabilized by reliance on trusted agents. In the latter half of his reign, Tiberius increasingly withdrew from public life, eventually residing on Capri. Literary sources portray this retreat as disengagement, though modern scholarship suggests it reflected a preference for remote administration rather than abdication. Administrative records indicate continued oversight of provincial affairs. Nonetheless, physical absence from Rome intensified senatorial unease and reinforced perceptions of autocracy exercised at a distance. Religious and cultural policy under Tiberius remained restrained. He resisted cultic honors during his lifetime and maintained traditional religious structures. Inscriptions record continued observance of Augustan reforms without significant innovation. This conservatism aligned with his broader governance style, emphasizing preservation over transformation. Succession planning remained unresolved. Tiberius outlived potential heirs, including Germanicus and Drusus the Younger. By the final years of his reign, the absence of a clear successor heightened political uncertainty. The elevation of Gaius Caligula occurred largely by default, supported by military loyalty rather than institutional consensus. This outcome highlighted the fragility of dynastic continuity under imperial rule. Interpretively, Tiberius' reign demonstrates that administrative competence alone could not guarantee political stability. The imperial system functioned effectively in managing resources, provinces, and armies, yet struggled to integrate elite participation without generating fear or resentment. Augustus had balanced authority through charisma and public legitimacy. Tiberius governed through restraint and control, exposing the system's dependence on personality as much as structure. A second analytical insight concerns precedent. Tiberius neither expanded nor dismantled Augustan institutions. Instead, he tested their durability under less accommodating leadership. The resulting tensions revealed fault lines that would reappear under later emperors, particularly regarding succession, senatorial relations, and military influence. By 37 CE, the empire remained intact, fiscally secure, and militarily stable. Yet the political atmosphere in Rome was brittle, defined by caution, suspicion, and disengagement. The imperial system had survived its first transition, but it had not resolved its inherent ambiguities. Administrative success did not ensure political stability under dynastic rule. Imperial authority proved vulnerable without elite cooperation. Between 37 and 68 CE, the Julio-Claudian system endured not because of institutional strength, but despite its repeated breakdowns. The reigns of Caligula, Claudius, and Nero revealed how fragile imperial governance became when legitimacy fractured between emperor, senate, military, and provincial society. The accession of Gaius Caesar, known as Caligula, in 37 CE initially appeared to restore confidence after the austere final years of Tiberius. Contemporary sources record public celebrations, amnesties, and fiscal generosity. Coinage from the early reign emphasizes continuity with Germanicus, reinforcing dynastic legitimacy. However, this period proved brief. Within 2 years, imperial authority began to destabilize under erratic decision-making and deteriorating relations with Rome's political elite. Ancient authors such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe Caligula's governance as unpredictable and confrontational. While their accounts are shaped by senatorial hostility, archaeological and administrative evidence confirms rapid fiscal depletion and inconsistent policy. Massive expenditures on games, construction, and court patronage strained the treasury accumulated under Tiberius. Records indicate extraordinary levies and asset confiscations were imposed to compensate, eroding elite support. A critical issue was Caligula's approach to authority. He bypassed senatorial consultation, mocked traditional offices, and centralized decision-making within the imperial court. Interpretively, this represented not insanity, but a rejection of the Augustan balance between dominance and deference. By undermining senatorial dignity without replacing it with stable administrative processes, Caligula exposed the regime to internal opposition. Military loyalty proved decisive. In 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard assassinated Caligula, acting independently of senatorial planning. Archaeological evidence from Praetorian installations supports the Guard's growing autonomy within Rome. The Senate briefly considered restoring the Republic, but lacked armed force. This moment revealed a structural shift. Emperors were now created and removed by military actors, not civic institutions. Claudius' accession followed immediately. Discovered and proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard, Claudius ruled without initial senatorial endorsement. His legitimacy derived from military backing and dynastic connection rather than elite consensus. This method of succession marked a significant departure from Augustan precedent, demonstrating that imperial authority could function without senatorial initiation. Claudius compensated for this weakness through administrative reform. Despite literary portrayals of personal inadequacy, epigraphic and archaeological evidence indicates an effective and systematic reign. Claudius expanded the imperial bureaucracy, increasingly relying on equestrian officials and freedmen administrators. Inscriptions record the formalization of offices responsible for finance, correspondence, and judicial review. Provincial governance benefited from these reforms. Claudius extended Roman citizenship to provincial elites, most notably in Gaul, as confirmed by the Lion Tablet inscription. This policy broadened the base of imperial support and integrated local leadership into Roman political culture. Interpretively, Claudius shifted legitimacy away from senatorial exclusivity toward administrative inclusion. Territorial expansion resumed cautiously. The conquest of Britain in 43 CE, supported by archaeological evidence at Camulogenum and other sites, provided military prestige and reinforced imperial authority. Unlike earlier expansions driven by individual commanders, the campaign was framed as a state initiative, reinforcing institutional continuity. Despite administrative success, court politics destabilized Claudius' reign. The prominence of imperial freedmen and the influence of successive wives, particularly Messalina and Agrippina the Younger, undermined senatorial confidence. Literary sources document executions and forced marriages linked to court intrigue. While some accounts exaggerate scandal, the frequency of elite removals indicates governance through personal networks rather than transparent institutions. Succession planning again revealed systemic weakness. Claudius' adoption of Nero over his biological son Britannicus reflected court maneuvering rather than legal principle. When Claudius died in 54 CE, likely by poisoning according to Tacitus, power transferred smoothly, but without institutional clarity. The precedent reinforced dynastic uncertainty. Nero's early reign benefited from experienced advisors, including Seneca and Burrus. Administrative continuity marked the first years, with moderate taxation, senatorial consultation, and legal restraint. Coinage and inscriptions emphasize civic harmony. This phase supports an interpretive distinction between structural capacity and personal governance. The system could function when managed competently. Over time, Nero increasingly disengaged from administration, prioritizing cultural patronage and personal prestige. He sponsored public performances, architectural projects, and festivals. Archaeological remains of the Domus Aurea confirm the scale of imperial expenditure following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. While reconstruction benefited urban infrastructure, elite resentment intensified due to forced property expropriations. Relations with the Senate deteriorated further as treason trials resumed and executions increased. Literary sources record widespread fear among elites, consistent with patterns observed under Tiberius. Nero's absence from traditional governance roles weakened informal cooperation, while his reliance on favorites mirrored earlier court-centric rule. Provincial unrest exposed the limits of imperial authority. The revolt of Boudica in Britain, 60 to 61 CE, confirmed by archaeological destruction layers at Londinium and Camulogenum, revealed administrative overreach and local resentment. Simultaneously, unrest in Judea reflected tensions between Roman authority and regional religious structures. These conflicts required military suppression, diverting resources and attention. The final collapse occurred when military loyalty fractured. In 68 CE, revolts led by provincial governors, including Vindex and Galba, signaled loss of confidence. Tacitus records the Senate's eventual abandonment of Nero only after military support evaporated. The Praetorian Guard's withdrawal of loyalty sealed his fate. Nero's suicide ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Interpretively, this period demonstrates that imperial governance required sustained consensus across multiple power centers. Personal authority without senatorial cooperation produced instability. Administrative competence without dynastic clarity proved insufficient. Each reign exposed a different vulnerability within the same system. A second analytical insight concerns institutional fragility. While Augustan structures endured, Their effectiveness depended heavily on leadership style and elite accommodation. The absence of a formal succession mechanism magnified court intrigue and military intervention. By 68 CE, the imperial system had not collapsed, but dynastic legitimacy had. Authority now rested openly with armies and provincial commanders rather than inherited prestige. The dynasty's collapse exposed the military's decisive role in imperial succession. In 69 CE, emperors were made and unmade by armies. Rome's political center could no longer determine succession. Instead, authority depended on provincial legions and their commanders. Within a single year, four men claimed the imperial title, revealing the fragility of dynastic precedent and the decisive influence of military power in determining leadership. The death of Nero in 68 CE left a vacuum that no formal mechanism could resolve. The Senate briefly attempted to assert authority, declaring Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, emperor. Galba's recognition was largely legalistic, rooted in his senatorial rank and distance from court intrigue. Archaeological records indicate limited urban investment during his short reign, reflecting his administrative focus on legitimacy rather than reform. However, Galba's lack of military engagement proved critical. He could not secure loyalty from key legions in Germany and the Rhine frontier. Galba's approach exposed the shifting power dynamics within the empire. Soldiers had previously supported emperors through loyalty to family or reform promises. By 69 CE, legions expected tangible benefits: bonuses, promotions, or favorable postings. Galba's refusal to meet such expectations. Tacitus notes his failure to distribute promised donatives, eroded support quickly. Within months, Otho, a former ally, leveraged dissatisfaction among praetorians and provincial forces to supplant Galba. The assassination of Galba in January 69 CE demonstrates the lethal efficiency of military-backed coups and the declining authority of the Senate in imperial succession. Otho's reign, though brief, underscores the transactional nature of power. Numismatic evidence indicates rapid coinage production to fund military loyalty, while inscriptions in northern Italy reference troop levies and rewards. Otho attempted to stabilize his position by securing key urban centers and conciliating provincial governors. However, Vitellius, commander of legions along the Rhine, mobilized substantial forces to challenge him. Archaeological survey of Rhine forts confirms mobilization and logistical planning, highlighting the scale and speed of military operations that dictated political outcomes. The confrontation between Otho and Vitellius culminated in the Battle of Bedriacum in April 69 CE. Literary sources describe the decisive engagement, while archaeological evidence confirms rapid troop movements and temporary fortifications. Otho's defeat and subsequent suicide illustrate the vulnerability of emperors reliant on limited or localized support. Authority now clearly depended on the alignment of multiple legions across different provinces, emphasizing systemic dependence on military cohesion rather than dynastic inheritance. Vitellius assumed power in Rome with initial recognition from the Senate and urban populace. He engaged in ceremonial acts intended to legitimize his authority, including public games, coinage issuance, and legal proclamations. Yet his administration struggled with financial strain, factionalized court politics, and mutinous provinces. Inscriptions from Gaul and Germania report irregular tax collections, reflecting administrative instability. Vitellius' reliance on personal extravagance and military favor rather than structured governance further weakened institutional control. Meanwhile, Vespasian, commanding legions in Judea during the suppression of the Jewish revolt, declared himself emperor with the explicit support of eastern provinces. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence documents the logistics of his campaign, including troop movement across the Mediterranean and the mobilization of naval resources. His success illustrates a new model of authority. Provincial bases with operational military control could directly challenge central power, bypassing traditional senatorial endorsement. The subsequent confrontation between Vitellius and Vespasian involved coordinated multi-front campaigns. Inscriptions and contemporary accounts describe strategic sieges, negotiations with provincial elites, and troop morale management. Vitellius' forces, although initially numerically superior, suffered from poor coordination and internal dissent. The capture and execution of Vitellius in December 69 CE concluded the chaotic year and established Vespasian as the sole emperor, demonstrating the decisive role of disciplined provincial military power in securing imperial authority. Interpretively, the year of the four emperors demonstrates a fundamental structural vulnerability. The absence of formal succession protocols transformed military loyalty into the primary determinant of political legitimacy. Each claimant's authority depended on the alignment of provincial legions, highlighting the decentralization of coercive power within the empire. Traditional civic and senatorial mechanisms, while retained nominally, were insufficient to enforce continuity. A second insight concerns the interaction between military expectations and imperial administration. Pay, donatives, and postings became central political instruments, influencing strategy, governance, and even ceremonial representation in Rome. Numismatic and inscriptional evidence corroborates this transactional dynamic, revealing how systemic dependency on the army shaped the political landscape. The rapid succession of Galba, Otho, and Vitellius also illustrates the importance of geographic distribution of forces. Provinces such as Hispania, Germania, and the Eastern Mediterranean had emerged as autonomous centers of military and administrative power. Archaeological surveys of legionary camps indicate both logistical sophistication and regional autonomy. The emperor could not govern effectively without consolidating support across these decentralized power bases. Finally, the resolution of 69 CE established precedent for subsequent imperial practice. Vespasian's consolidation relied on combining military loyalty with administrative reform and senatorial inclusion. He systematically rewarded troops, restructured provincial governance, and stabilized the treasury. These measures underscored that military-backed authority required complementary civil administration to maintain long-term stability. By the end of 69 CE, Rome's political center remained intact, but authority had shifted decisively. The Senate retained ceremonial influence, yet real power was concentrated in emperors with direct military support. This year exposed the structural conditions for imperial consolidation and demonstrated that dynastic legitimacy alone was insufficient for political survival. Military-backed authority demanded administrative restructuring. Stability returned when authority aligned with institutional reform. After the turbulence of 69 CE, Vespasian established a model of governance that balanced military loyalty, fiscal responsibility, and provincial integration, creating a durable foundation for the Flavian dynasty and a resilient imperial framework. Vespasian's rise to power was rooted in military authority and provincial legitimacy. Unlike previous emperors who relied on Roman civic institutions or dynastic inheritance alone, he commanded the legions in Judea and enjoyed broad support across eastern provinces. Archaeological evidence, including legionary diplomas and inscriptions, confirms his operational control of key military bases prior to his arrival in Rome. This alignment of provincial power with imperial ambition enabled a controlled transition from civil war to structured authority. Upon assuming the throne, Vespasian prioritized fiscal stabilization. The civil wars had depleted the treasury, disrupted taxation, and created a climate of economic uncertainty. Literary sources, including Suetonius and Cassius Dio, record his implementation of moderate taxation reforms and efficient revenue collection. Papyri from Egypt demonstrate stricter oversight of provincial income and systematic accounting of land and grain production. Vespasian's financial strategy reduced deficits and reinforced state credibility, illustrating the connection between fiscal policy and political stability. Provincial integration formed a second pillar of governance. Vespasian reinforced Roman administration in key territories, standardizing legal procedures and reinforcing the authority of governors. Inscriptions from Asia Minor, Gaul, and Britain indicate renewed urban investment and public works, which promoted loyalty among local elites. This approach contrasted with earlier periods in which provincial administration had been subordinate to court favoritism or intermittent military intervention. Vespasian's strategy emphasized institutional authority over personal patronage. Reconstruction and urban development also communicated stability. Rome itself required attention after the civil unrest of the preceding years. Archaeological evidence documents the initiation of major building programs, including the Temple of Peace and preliminary work on the Flavian Amphitheater. These projects served multiple functions, providing employment, demonstrating imperial presence, and integrating civic life into a visible framework of restored authority. Coinage from Vespasian's reign emphasizes public welfare and military victories, reinforcing his image as a stabilizing figure. Vespasian's legal reforms strengthened both the judiciary and provincial governance. He codified regulations governing public finance, inheritance, and civic rights, as recorded in contemporary inscriptions and later juristic references. By clarifying administrative responsibilities and formalizing procedures, Vespasian reduced arbitrary enforcement and curtailed abuses of power. Interpretively, these reforms reinforced the principle that authority was legitimate only when exercised through institutional channels rather than personal discretion. Military policy under Vespasian combined restraint with strategic deployment. He maintained sufficient forces along volatile frontiers, particularly the Rhine, Danube, and eastern provinces, while reducing the overall number of legions compared to the chaotic pre-Flavian years. Archaeological surveys of fortifications and troop movements indicate careful consolidation and efficient supply management. Loyalty was maintained through regular pay, veteran settlements, and disciplined command structures. These measures reinforced the connection between military stability and administrative competence. A critical insight concerns the interplay between central authority and provincial governance. Vespasian's policies relied on integrating local elites into the imperial framework rather than marginalizing them. Epigraphic evidence from provincial councils and civic offices demonstrates continued elite participation in municipal and imperial affairs. By co-opting existing networks, Vespasian ensured that authority was both enforceable and locally legitimate, reducing the risk of revolt. Fiscal, legal, and military reforms were complemented by the management of imperial succession. Early in his reign, Vespasian emphasized dynastic continuity through the recognition of his sons, Titus and Domitian. By positioning them in military and administrative roles, he established clear lines of succession and reinforced the perception of stability. Archaeological evidence shows Titus' involvement in Judean campaigns, reflecting both military competence and dynastic legitimacy. Religious and ceremonial policy further legitimized authority. Vespasian restored traditional cults, expanded priesthoods, and invested in temples and civic rituals. Inscriptions record offerings and dedications that reinforce continuity with Augustan and Julio-Claudian precedents. These measures linked imperial authority to Rome's cultural and religious framework, emphasizing that power was exercised within established institutional and societal norms. Interpretively, Vespasian's reign demonstrates that stability was contingent on the alignment of authority with systematic governance. Unlike predecessors who relied primarily on personal charisma, patronage, or military intimidation, Vespasian codified and institutionalized rule. His success reflects a structural insight. The durability of imperial power depends on effective administration, fiscal responsibility, and integration of provincial and military actors into a coherent system. A second analytical insight concerns the precedent set for future emperors. Vespasian's combination of military authority, fiscal prudence, and legal reform created an operational template for imperial governance. Subsequent emperors could inherit an established administrative framework, reducing the likelihood of abrupt collapse and enhancing the legitimacy of succession. This continuity allowed the Flavian dynasty to consolidate authority despite initial post-Civil War instability. By the end of his reign in 79 CE, Rome had recovered from a period of dynastic chaos. The treasury was replenished, provinces were integrated into a coherent administrative system, and military loyalty had been stabilized. Public works and legal codification signaled a return to orderly governance. Authority, once fragmented and contested, now rested on a combination of military support, institutional legitimacy, and dynastic continuity. Vespasian's policies enabled a new imperial equilibrium, Adoptive succession redefined imperial legitimacy. Following decades of dynastic uncertainty, Nerva's selection of Trajan as heir signaled a fundamental shift. Authority could be transmitted through merit and consensus, rather than bloodline alone, linking military success, senatorial approval, and administrative competence. The assassination of Domitian in 96 CE ended the Flavian line and created an opportunity for institutional recalibration. The Senate, wary of further autocracy, endorsed Marcus Aurelius Nerva as emperor. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio and Suetonius, emphasized that Nerva's legitimacy relied on senatorial support rather than military command. However, Nerva's reign immediately revealed structural limitations. Without secure control of the legions, imperial authority remained contingent upon negotiation with commanders stationed along the frontiers, particularly in Germania and Pannonia. Nerva's principal innovation was adoption as a mechanism of succession. Lacking a biological heir, he formally adopted Trajan, a distinguished general with established loyalty among the legions. Inscriptions and coinage commemorate this adoption, underscoring the combination of merit, military support, and legal formality. Interpretively, this practice institutionalized a system in which imperial competence and consent replaced dynastic entitlement as the primary basis of legitimacy. Trajan's accession in 98 CE consolidated this strategy. With command over loyal troops and broad senatorial approval, he began a reign characterized by disciplined administration, infrastructural development, and calculated military expansion. Contemporary inscriptions, including milestones and dedicatory texts across Hispania and the Italian peninsula, attest to Trajan's engagement with both civic and provincial communities, reinforcing legitimacy through visible governance. The Dacian campaigns, 101 to 102 and 105 to 106 CE, exemplify the integration of military achievement into political authority. Archaeological evidence from the Trajanic Wars, including fortifications, weapons caches, and coins minted to commemorate victories, demonstrates the logistical sophistication and strategic planning of Roman operations. Trajan's column in Rome provides detailed visual documentation of the campaigns, illustrating troop movements, siege techniques, and the incorporation of provincial auxiliaries. These campaigns expanded imperial boundaries while consolidating the perception of competent leadership, linking territorial gain to systemic authority rather than personal ambition alone. Fiscal policy accompanied military expansion. The acquisition of Dacian gold mines, confirmed by numismatic analysis and papyri, enhanced the imperial treasury, providing funds for veterans, infrastructure, and urban development. This influx stabilized the economy and allowed Trajan to fund public works, including aqueducts, roads, and civic spaces, without imposing extraordinary taxation. Interpretively, military conquest was sustainable because it integrated resource extraction, administrative oversight, and civic investment. Provincial governance also evolved under Trajan. Inscriptions from Asia Minor, Gaul, and Britain indicate a standardization of provincial administration, with governors accountable for tax collection, justice, and infrastructure. Military and civil authority remained formally distinct, but coordination was reinforced through communication networks, courier systems, and recorded ordinances. This integration allowed expansion without undermining institutional stability. Adoptive succession had additional political implications. It created incentives for meritocratic service within the military and bureaucracy, as positions of responsibility were increasingly linked to demonstrated competence rather than birthright. Epigraphic evidence shows the rise of equestrian officials in administrative and fiscal roles, reflecting a professionalized bureaucracy supporting the emperor. Interpretively, the adoption model strengthened governance structures by aligning authority with proven ability rather than dynastic prestige alone. Trajan's building programs further communicated stability and legitimacy. The Forum of Trajan, Trajan's market, and infrastructure in Roman colonies illustrate the connection between urban development, public visibility, and imperial authority. Coinage and inscriptions accompanying these projects emphasized civic benefit and military success, embedding political messaging in physical space. These actions reinforced the emperor's image as a guarantor of order, prosperity, and institutional competence. Trajan's approach to expansion also highlights a systemic principle. Conquest was sustainable when coupled with administrative integration and economic planning. Dacia's annexation required settlement of veterans, establishment of tax structures, and reinforcement of urban and military infrastructure. Archaeological surveys confirm the creation of new colonies and fortresses, indicating careful attention to long-term stability rather than short-term territorial gain. The integration of conquered territories into provincial administration exemplifies the balance between military authority and governance. Religious and ceremonial activities reinforced legitimacy without personal aggrandizement. Trajan maintained traditional priesthoods, promoted cultic observances, and publicly associated himself with civic rituals. Inscriptions and reliefs emphasize continuity with Augustus and the good emperors, linking authority to institutionalized practice rather than charisma alone. This alignment strengthened the perception that power derived from office and law as much as from conquest or personal renown. Interpretively, Nerva and Trajan demonstrate the complementary relationship between adoption, military competence, and administrative capacity. Authority no longer depended solely on bloodline or immediate public acclaim. Legitimacy emerged from systemic integration of institutional, military, and civic elements. The adoption strategy ensured continuity, reducing the risk of contested succession while reinforcing meritocratic principles. A second analytical insight concerns the long-term implications for imperial stability. By aligning succession with demonstrable competence and military approval, the system mitigated the recurrence of violent contestation observed in earlier dynasties. Inscriptions, coinage, and column reliefs serve as enduring evidence that institutional planning reinforced both expansion and domestic legitimacy. By 117 CE, under Trajan, Rome had achieved a peak of territorial extent and administrative coherence. Expansion was not merely a matter of conquest. It depended on the careful coordination of military, fiscal, and civic mechanisms. Authority rested on structured competence, supported by a framework that combined adoption, senatorial consultation, and provincial integration. Expansion required sustainable governance structures. Rome reached its limits and recognized them. Following Trajan's unprecedented territorial expansion, Hadrian shifted imperial strategy from conquest to consolidation, emphasizing defense, legal order, and the integration of diverse provincial populations into a sustainable empire. Hadrian ascended in 117 CE following Trajan's death, inheriting an empire that had attained its maximum geographical extent but faced logistical and administrative strain. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, note his immediate focus on internal stability. Unlike his predecessor, Hadrian prioritized the security of existing borders rather than further expansion, marking a strategic reorientation in imperial policy. The construction and reinforcement of frontier systems epitomized this approach. Hadrian's Wall in Britain, erected between 122 to 128 CE, represents a tangible manifestation of defensive strategy. Archaeological evidence confirms that the wall combined stone fortifications, watchtowers, and mile castles, organized to control movement, facilitate troop deployment, and provide early warning against incursions. Similar fortifications along the Rhine and Danube reflect a broader imperial emphasis on territorial management rather than conquest. These measures indicate a systematic approach to security, integrating military presence with civil infrastructure. Hadrian's attention to the military extended beyond fortifications. He conducted extensive inspections of legions across the provinces, promoting disciplined organization and standardized logistics. Inscriptions and military diplomas confirm reforms in pay, service terms, and veteran settlements. By professionalizing the army while avoiding excessive expansion, Hadrian reinforced loyalty and operational efficiency without imposing undue financial burdens on the state. Legal codification was another cornerstone of Hadrian's consolidation. The Perpetua et Consuetudo reforms sought to standardize provincial law, clarify jurisdiction, and formalize legal procedures. Roman jurists such as Salvius Julianus, operating under Hadrian's supervision, contributed to the drafting of systematic legal texts, including the Edictum Perpetuum. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions recording legal decrees and civic ordinances, confirms the implementation of these reforms across multiple provinces. This codification enhanced administrative predictability and reinforced imperial authority through law rather than personal decree. Provincial integration under Hadrian was closely linked to cultural and civic policy. He invested in urban development, including temples, theaters, and public spaces, fostering local engagement within the imperial framework. Archaeological remains in cities such as Antinopolis, Athens, and Jerash demonstrate architectural programs that merged Roman urban planning with local traditions. These initiatives facilitated cultural cohesion, aligning provincial elites with imperial governance while respecting regional identity. Hadrian's policy also emphasized mobility and direct oversight. He undertook extensive tours of the provinces, covering the Italian peninsula, Hispania, Gaul, Britain, the Balkans, Asia Minor, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Literary accounts, corroborated by inscriptions and milestones, describe administrative inspections, urban inaugurations, and military reviews. These tours allowed the emperor to monitor provincial compliance, reinforce loyalty, and intervene directly in disputes, demonstrating that imperial presence could substitute for coercion in maintaining order. Fiscal management remained a priority. Hadrian stabilized revenues through standardized taxation and careful oversight of provincial resources. Papyri from Egypt, along with inscriptions from North Africa and Asia Minor, indicate regularized tax collection and accountability mechanisms. By balancing expenditure on infrastructure, military, and civic initiatives, Hadrian maintained financial solvency while reinforcing institutional legitimacy. Religious and cultural integration also served political ends. Hadrian promoted traditional Roman cults alongside provincial religious practices, fostering inclusion while asserting overarching imperial authority. Inscriptions and temple dedications across the empire reflect a dual strategy, maintaining the symbolic unity of Rome while accommodating local traditions. This approach strengthened civic loyalty and reduced potential unrest rooted in cultural marginalization. Interpretively, Hadrian's reign illustrates a systemic principle. Imperial stability depends on internal coherence as much as external expansion. Defensive fortifications, codified legal systems, and cultural integration created an environment in which authority could be exercised predictably, reducing reliance on extraordinary personal charisma or coercion. By institutionalizing control mechanisms, Hadrian embedded resilience into the empire's structure. A second insight concerns administrative centralization and delegation. While the emperor maintained ultimate authority, Hadrian empowered provincial governors, equestrian administrators, and jurists to manage routine governance. Inscriptions and correspondence, including those recorded in the Historia Augusta, document a network of oversight that combined local autonomy with imperial supervision. This delegation reduced bottlenecks in decision-making and enhanced compliance across diverse territories. Hadrian's approach also revealed a strategic adaptation to geography. By recognizing the logistical limits of imperial expansion, he concentrated on natural boundaries, rivers, mountains, and constructed fortifications, rather than attempting to integrate distant or difficult-to-control regions. Archaeological evidence along the Danube and Euphrates confirms coordinated fort systems designed to monitor movement and maintain defensive depth. Interpretively, Hadrian acknowledged that sustainable authority required respecting practical limits rather than pursuing maximal territorial acquisition. By the end of his reign in 138 CE, Hadrian had established a model for a durable, stable empire. Borders were defined and defensible, laws standardized and predictable, and provincial elites integrated into governance. Military power was professionalized and disciplined, and fiscal policies ensured long-term solvency. Urban development and cultural investment reinforced civic cohesion and imperial legitimacy. Stability now depended on internal coherence. Rome governed best when it governed quietly. Under Antoninus Pius, 138 to 161 CE, the empire experienced a period of relative peace, administrative efficiency, and legal refinement, demonstrating that imperial strength could emerge from careful management rather than conquest or spectacle. Antoninus Pius inherited the empire from Hadrian with well-defined frontiers, a professionalized military, and integrated provinces. Literary sources, including the Historia Augusta and Cassius Dio, emphasize that his reign was remarkably free of major conflict. Unlike earlier emperors whose authority depended on military campaigns or crisis management, Antoninus' legitimacy rested on institutional continuity and bureaucratic competence. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence confirms steady investment in provincial infrastructure, urban maintenance, and civic monuments, reinforcing the perception of stable governance. Administrative continuity defined Antoninus' approach. He retained Hadrian's codified legal frameworks, while refining them to improve provincial governance. Inscriptions record revisions in provincial legal practice, emphasizing predictable tax collection, judicial clarity, and equitable treatment of local elites. The emperor delegated significant authority to governors and equestrian administrators, balancing local initiative with imperial oversight. This delegation strengthened administrative efficiency and mitigated the risks associated with centralized decision-making. Fiscal policy under Antoninus was conservative but effective. Coinage from his reign demonstrates steady minting practices and restrained public expenditure. Papyrus records from Egypt show consistent tax collection and prudent allocation of resources. Unlike predecessors who relied on extraordinary levies or confiscations, Antoninus maintained solvency through careful management of existing resources. This fiscal stability enabled investment in urban programs, military upkeep, and civic welfare without destabilizing the treasury. The military remained disciplined and loyal, though largely untested in large-scale campaigns. Antoninus maintained legions along the Rhine and Danube, ensuring readiness without engaging in extensive offensive operations. Archaeological surveys of forts along the limes reveal routine upgrades, signaling preparedness rather than expansion. Interpretively, this strategy demonstrates that imperial authority could be sustained by deterrence and organization, rather than continuous conquest. Legal refinement characterized Antoninus' domestic policy. Jurists such as Papinian and Julianus contributed to the codification of civil and provincial law under imperial supervision. Inscriptions and surviving legal texts attest to standardized procedures for contracts, property disputes, and civic administration. This emphasis on legal predictability reinforced the rule of law as a foundation of imperial legitimacy, reducing reliance on personal discretion or arbitrary edicts. Public works reinforced the perception of order and prosperity. Temples, aqueducts, roads, and urban infrastructure received systematic attention. Archaeological evidence, including construction inscriptions and civic dedications, illustrates a pattern of incremental, sustainable investment. These projects were less spectacular than Trajanic or Hadrianic programs, yet they strengthened civic cohesion and reinforced the presence of imperial authority across the provinces. Religious and cultural integration continued to consolidate the empire. Antoninus promoted traditional Roman cults, provincial temples, and priesthoods, often sponsoring civic festivals and dedications. Epigraphic evidence shows careful attention to local traditions, emphasizing inclusion while reinforcing central authority. By respecting provincial identity within a Roman framework, Antoninus fostered loyalty and minimized unrest. Interpretively, Antoninus' reign demonstrates that quiet governance can be highly effective. Stability was not imposed by force or spectacle but embedded in institutional structures, legal clarity, and administrative competence. Authority depended on predictability, fiscal management, and the professionalization of both civil and military apparatuses. This model contrasts sharply with the turbulence of earlier dynasties, highlighting the benefits of continuity and procedural governance. A second analytical insight concerns elite integration. Senators and equestrians were systematically involved in administration and fiscal oversight, reducing the likelihood of factional disputes. Inscriptions from provincial councils and urban magistracies confirm widespread participation, indicating that imperial authority was reinforced through collaboration rather than coercion. Despite the outward tranquility, underlying pressures persisted. Demographic shifts, including population growth and urbanization, placed long-term demands on resources. Military recruitment, though untested, required careful management of manpower and logistics to sustain frontier defense. These structural challenges, largely invisible during Antoninus' reign, would become more pronounced under subsequent emperors. By the end of Antoninus Pius' reign in 161 CE, Rome had achieved a high degree of internal cohesion. Frontiers were secure, the treasury solvent, legal systems codified, and civic infrastructure maintained. The emperor's reliance on quiet administration, institutional oversight, and procedural fairness reinforced the durability of imperial authority without resorting to conquest or coercion. Peace masked underlying demographic and military pressures. The philosopher-emperor ruled during systemic stress. Marcus Aurelius inherited an empire at peace internally, but external pressures and unforeseen crises would reveal the limits of even well-structured administration and disciplined governance. Marcus Aurelius assumed the throne in 161 CE following the peaceful succession of Antoninus Pius. Literary sources, including the Historia Augusta and Cassius Dio, emphasize his philosophical temperament and commitment to Stoic principles. His reign combined personal intellectual rigor with a pragmatic approach to governance, but circumstances demanded responses to pressures that exceeded the quiet stability of his predecessor. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence demonstrates extensive military campaigns, urban investment, and provincial administration, reflecting active engagement with structural challenges across the empire. One of the most significant crises was the Antonine Plague, which erupted around 165 CE and persisted intermittently for nearly 2 decades. Contemporary sources describe widespread mortality, though precise numbers remain debated. Archaeological evidence, including burial sites in urban centers and provincial cemeteries, indicates elevated death rates consistent with epidemic conditions. The plague disrupted trade, reduced labor availability, and increased fiscal strain, forcing Marcus Aurelius to adapt administrative and military policies to maintain governance and supply chains. Interpretively, the epidemic underscores how demographic shocks could stress even the most robust imperial systems. Simultaneously, frontier conflicts demanded sustained military engagement. The Marcomannic Wars 166 to 180 CE along the Danube exemplify the challenges of defending extended borders. Inscriptions and fortifications along the limes confirm extensive troop deployments, logistical coordination, and construction of defensive works. Marcus Aurelius personally oversaw campaigns, balancing strategic defense with fiscal prudence. His management illustrates the dual role of the emperor as both administrative supervisor and military commander. Military strategy combined reactive defense with disciplined planning. Legions were rotated along the Danube and Rhine, fortified towns were expanded, and temporary camps were established to manage border pressure. Epigraphic evidence highlights awards for valor, veteran settlements, and structured recruitment. This approach maintained operational effectiveness while mitigating desertion and unrest, demonstrating a systemic reliance on military professionalism under sustained stress. Administrative adaptation was also necessary. The Antonine Plague reduced provincial revenues, requiring adjustments to taxation, grain supply, and fiscal oversight. Papyri from Egypt and inscriptions from Gaul indicate efforts to maintain equitable revenue collection despite population decline. Marcus Aurelius coordinated with provincial governors and equestrian officials to ensure continuity of civic services and military provisioning. This continuity reflects the resilience of bureaucratic structures developed under his predecessors. Legal and civic policy remained a focus, reinforcing institutional stability. Marcus Aurelius codified legal norms and clarified judicial responsibilities, emphasizing procedural consistency and fairness. Surviving inscriptions and legal fragments attest to reform in inheritance law, municipal governance, and provincial administration. These measures ensured that the administration could continue functioning despite simultaneous demographic, military, and logistical pressures. Cultural and ideological authority complemented practical governance. Marcus Aurelius promoted Stoic philosophy as a guiding principle for rulership, emphasizing rational decision-making, duty, and service. The Meditations, written during campaigns, provide insight into the intellectual framework underpinning policy. By linking personal philosophy to public administration, he reinforced a moral legitimacy that complemented structural authority. Archaeological evidence, including coinage and public dedications, reflects the projection of imperial virtue alongside civic and military authority. Interpretively, Marcus Aurelius' reign demonstrates that even a disciplined, philosophically oriented ruler could not isolate the state from systemic stressors. Epidemic disease, frontier warfare, and demographic pressure imposed constraints on policy and administration. The emperor's success depended on the durability of institutions, legal, fiscal, and military, established during prior reigns. Without these structures, Rome's response to crises would have been far less effective. A second analytical insight concerns the limits of centralized authority. Despite personal oversight and active engagement, Marcus Aurelius relied extensively on provincial governors, equestrian administrators, and military commanders. Epigraphic records confirm delegated authority for logistics, justice, and recruitment. This reliance illustrates a recurring structural principle. The emperor functions best as a coordinator of systemic power, not as an omnipotent actor. By 180 CE, Marcus Aurelius had maintained imperial cohesion despite sustained military campaigns and demographic disruption. Rome's borders were largely secure, provincial administration remained functional, and fiscal systems continued to operate under strain. The emperor's death marked the end of an era of relative continuity but highlighted emerging vulnerabilities, including succession challenges and growing reliance on military authority. Crisis tested even Rome's strongest institutions. Personal authority replaced institutional restraint. The reign of Commodus demonstrates how the concentration of power in the hands of a single ruler, unmediated by precedent or administrative networks, could destabilize even a mature imperial system. Commodus ascended the throne in 180 CE following the death of Marcus Aurelius, inheriting an empire that had benefited from decades of institutional consolidation and administrative continuity. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio and Herodian, portray his reign as marked by extravagant court politics and a departure from traditional governance. Unlike his father, Commodus emphasized personal rule, increasingly sidelining established bureaucratic channels, senatorial consultation, and provincial elites. Archaeological evidence, including monumental architecture and coinage, confirms the shift toward symbolic self-representation over systemic governance. The emperor's self-fashioning became central to his authority. Commodus associated himself with Hercules, commissioning statues, reliefs, and coinage depicting himself with lion skins, club, and other iconography of strength. Inscriptions from Rome and provincial cities reinforce this deliberate identification, emphasizing martial and divine attributes. Interpretively, this transformation of imperial imagery indicates a shift from institutional legitimacy to personal charisma, a model that centralized authority in symbolic performance rather than administrative competence. Court politics increasingly dominated governance. Key positions in the administration were often filled based on loyalty to the emperor rather than merit, with freedmen, favorites, and family members exercising disproportionate influence. Tacitus notes that advisors and courtiers could wield de facto authority over provincial appointments, finance, and legal decisions. This personalization of power weakened the functioning of formal offices and reduced transparency, leaving governance vulnerable to factional disputes and mismanagement. Militarization of authority became a defining feature. Commodus participated personally in gladiatorial games and military exercises, projecting martial dominance to consolidate loyalty among troops and the urban populace. Epigraphic evidence from military diplomas and honorific inscriptions highlights increased emphasis on public military display and symbolic victories rather than strategic campaigns. By conflating personal prestige with military legitimacy, Commodus shifted structural authority from disciplined command and provincial integration toward performance-driven loyalty. Fiscal policy reflected this personalization. Excessive spending on games, monumental construction, and gladiatorial spectacles strained the treasury. Archaeological and numismatic evidence indicates coin debasement and increased taxation to fund imperial extravagance. While some administrative structures remained functional, these pressures reduced the state's capacity to invest in long-term infrastructure or frontier security, demonstrating how the narrowing of governance priorities can weaken systemic resilience. Provincial administration was similarly affected. Governors were increasingly selected for loyalty to Commodus rather than expertise, undermining uniformity and predictability. Inscriptions from Asia Minor and Gaul indicate that appointments became more episodic and less tied to legal or procedural standards. The disruption of institutional norms compromised governance, increasing the potential for local resistance and administrative inefficiency. Interpretively, Commodus' reign illustrates the structural hazards of personal rule in a previously mature imperial system. Authority concentrated in one individual, without adherence to codified procedures, institutional continuity, or meritocratic succession, creates fragility. Whereas Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius had relied on distributed governance and legal oversight, Commodus' reliance on symbolic representation and court loyalty destabilized both administration and fiscal stability. Cultural and symbolic strategies reinforced centralization of power. Coinage, architectural projects, and public ceremonies emphasized the emperor's personal authority over civic or provincial identity. For example, the construction of the Commodusera Colossus in Rome physically manifested imperial dominance, integrating urban space with the emperor's personal imagery. These projects projected authority but diverted resources from systemic priorities, exemplifying the trade-off between symbolism and administrative efficacy. A second analytical insight concerns the interaction between military and civic legitimacy. Commodus' personal engagement with the legions, coupled with his public displays, created temporary loyalty, but it lacked the institutional depth to sustain authority during crises. Unlike Trajan or Hadrian, where military discipline was reinforced through standardized policy and provincial integration, Commodus' approach tied loyalty to performance and spectacle, increasing vulnerability to revolt or instability. By 192 CE, Commodus' focus on personal rule, court politics, and symbolic power had significantly weakened the institutional foundations of the Roman Empire. Although outward appearances suggested continuity and control, underlying structures, legal, fiscal, and administrative, had been eroded. Elite dissatisfaction, military dependence, and economic strain left the empire more vulnerable than in preceding decades. Imperial legitimacy weakened as governance narrowed. Rome's stability proved conditional. The assassination of Commodus in 192 CE exposed the fragility of imperial authority when concentrated in a single individual, revealing how political legitimacy depended on institutional support, elite cooperation, and military alignment. Commodus' death on December 31, 192 CE, resulted from a coordinated conspiracy involving the Praetorian prefect, court officials, and senators. Literary accounts, including Cassius Dio and Herodian, emphasize that elite dissatisfaction, personal grievances, and fear of continued mismanagement drove the assassination. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence, including inscriptions commemorating subsequent honors for conspirators, suggests the participation of multiple factions and the central role of institutional actors in facilitating regime change. The immediate political fallout was severe. The power vacuum triggered rapid negotiation between the Senate and the military to identify a successor. Pertinax, a respected senator and former provincial governor, was selected as emperor by a combination of senatorial endorsement and Praetorian support. This process demonstrates the continued, albeit strained, role of institutional mechanisms in stabilizing succession after the collapse of personal rule. Pertinax's reign, however, lasted only 3 months. The emperor attempted to impose fiscal discipline, restore administrative order, and curtail Praetorian privilege, including their role in auctioning imperial authority. Literary sources note that these reforms antagonized the Guard, culminating in Pertinax's murder in March 193 CE. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions referencing brief honors and dedications, corroborates the rapid turnover of leadership and the symbolic contestation of power in Rome. The Praetorian auction following Pertinax's assassination exemplifies the conditionality of imperial legitimacy. Didius Julianus purchased the throne by promising financial rewards to the Praetorians, bypassing senatorial consultation, provincial approval, and military consensus. Contemporary sources describe widespread discontent and the erosion of public trust. This episode underscores a systemic vulnerability. When authority is commoditized, governance structures cannot function effectively, and institutional norms are subordinated to short-term coercion. Provincial and military reactions further destabilize the capital. Governors and legions across Gaul, Germania, and the eastern provinces mobilized to challenge Julianus' authority, emphasizing the decentralized nature of military power. Epigraphic evidence and legionary diplomas from this period indicate coordinated mobilization against central authority, demonstrating that legitimacy required both recognition by Rome and active provincial support. The Civil War of 193 CE, often termed the Year of the Five Emperors, resulted from this fragmentation of authority. Septimius Severus, commanding eastern legions, advanced on Rome, defeating forces loyal to Julianus. Literary and archaeological sources confirm rapid troop movements, fortification of strategic sites, and coordinated assaults, highlighting the military's decisive role in resolving succession disputes. Julianus was executed, and Severus' victory reinforced the principle that imperial power depended on military alignment rather than senatorial or popular sanction alone. Interpretively, the assassination of Commodus and subsequent instability reveal the limits of personal rule and the conditional nature of authority. Even a mature and previously stable empire could fracture when succession was ambiguous, elites were alienated, or military loyalty was transactional. These events illustrate that systemic governance, legal, fiscal, and administrative structures, remained necessary to maintain order, yet could be rapidly undermined by concentrated personal power or elite factionalism. A second insight concerns elite behavior in crisis. Senators, equestrian administrators, and military officers acted strategically, balancing loyalty, self-interest, and the perceived legitimacy of potential rulers. Epigraphic and literary evidence suggests that institutional actors were capable of both supporting and subverting imperial authority depending on circumstances. This dynamic emphasizes the interdependence of central authority and elite cooperation. By the end of 192 CE, Rome had entered a period of acute volatility. The assassination of Commodus, the brief and contested reign of Pertinax, and the Praetorian auction demonstrated that imperial stability relied on the alignment of multiple structural factors: military loyalty, institutional legitimacy, fiscal solvency, and elite consent. Failure in any domain could precipitate rapid crisis. The empire entered a volatile phase. The army became the empire's core institution. Septimius Severus' rise following the Year of the Five Emperors illustrates how military power, once a supporting pillar of imperial authority, transformed into the central mechanism of governance. Septimius Severus emerged from the eastern provinces with the support of the legions in Pannonia, Moesia, and Syria. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio and Herodian, emphasize that his claim to the throne was validated primarily through military allegiance rather than senatorial or urban endorsement. Epigraphic evidence from legionary diplomas, dedicatory inscriptions, and construction projects confirms Severus' operational control over key military units, highlighting the critical link between armed forces and political legitimacy. One of Severus' first initiatives was to secure loyalty through financial incentives. He increased legionary pay substantially, augmented bonuses, and expanded veteran benefits. Coinage and papyri from this period corroborate these reforms, showing the allocation of imperial funds toward soldiers' donatives and pensions. By tying loyalty directly to material reward, Severus institutionalized the army as the foundation of imperial authority, demonstrating a systemic shift from civic and bureaucratic legitimacy to militarized governance. Legal centralization complemented military dominance. Severus undertook a series of codifications and reforms to standardize legal authority across the empire. Jurists such as Papinian and Ulpian were employed to produce coherent and enforceable statutes, recorded in inscriptions and legal fragments. These reforms reinforced the emperor's authority by subordinating provincial administration to centrally directed judicial norms, ensuring that military power was complemented by bureaucratic oversight. Provincial administration under Severus reflected the militarization of governance. Governors were often selected for their ability to command legions or maintain frontier security rather than purely for civic expertise. Inscriptions and military diplomas show a greater concentration of equestrian and senatorial officers with combined civil and military responsibilities. This duality reinforced the emperor's control over both provincial administration and armed forces, further entwining political legitimacy with martial authority. Dynastic militarization also emerged as a defining feature. Severus elevated his sons, Caracalla and Geta, to co-emperors, assigning them military commands and responsibilities across key provinces. Literary sources describe joint campaigns and coordinated strategic planning, while inscriptions attest to their formal recognition by the legions. By embedding the dynasty within the military hierarchy, Severus ensured succession continuity while reinforcing the army as a stabilizing, though increasingly autonomous, institutional actor. Military campaigns during Severus' reign, particularly in Britain, the Danube region, and the Parthian frontier, further illustrate the centrality of the army. Archaeological surveys document fortifications, troop rotations, and logistical networks supporting sustained campaigns. These operations required coordination across multiple provinces, reflecting a system in which the emperor's authority was operationalized through military organization rather than urban governance alone. Fiscal policy under Severus prioritized the army, generating strain on traditional provincial revenue streams. Coin debasement, taxation adjustments, and reallocation of resources toward military expenditure are documented through numismatic analysis and papyri. While these policies secured loyalty and operational capacity, they also increased the long-term economic vulnerability of the empire, demonstrating the trade-off between military dominance and financial sustainability. Interpretively, Severus' reign illustrates a structural transformation. Authority became inseparable from the army's support. The emperor's power was contingent on maintaining active, materially incentivized military forces capable of both enforcing policy and managing succession. This dependency introduced systemic volatility, as fiscal pressures, mutiny risk, and regional legions' autonomy increased the potential for instability. A second analytical insight concerns the balance between centralization and delegation. Severus centralized legal and administrative authority to reinforce his control over military-backed governance. However, this centralization relied on competent subordinates, provincial commanders, and jurists to implement policy effectively. Epigraphic evidence confirms that delegated authority was essential, highlighting the interdependence of centralized military power and bureaucratic administration in sustaining imperial order. Severus' reign set a precedent for subsequent soldier emperors. By institutionalizing military primacy, dynastic militarization, and centralized legal oversight, he reshaped the mechanisms of imperial governance. Authority now rested on the alignment of armed forces with administrative capacity rather than purely on civic consensus, senatorial recognition, or dynastic legitimacy alone. By 211 CE, with Severus' death, the empire had solidified military dominance as the core institution of rule. Yet the concentration of power in the army also sowed the conditions for later succession conflicts and internal instability. Military dominance reshaped imperial governance. Crisis became structural. The 3rd century witnessed an unprecedented convergence of political, military, and economic pressures, exposing systemic vulnerabilities within the Roman Empire and demonstrating that even a mature imperial system could fracture under sustained stress. The assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 CE marked the beginning of the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. Literary sources, including the Historia Augusta and Zosimus, describe a rapid succession of emperors, often elevated and deposed by the army within months or years. Epigraphic evidence from military diplomas, fort inscriptions, and provincial dedications confirms the frequency of turnover and the growing prominence of regional commanders in determining imperial authority. This pattern revealed a structural weakness. Legitimacy was increasingly dependent on immediate military support rather than institutional continuity. Political fragmentation intensified as provincial commanders declared themselves emperors. The empire saw multiple concurrent claimants, with power bases in Gaul, Britain, the Rhine, the Danube, and the eastern provinces. Archaeological surveys indicate local coinage, fortifications, and administrative inscriptions asserting loyalty to specific claimants. These parallel centers of power disrupted traditional administrative channels, forcing the central government to negotiate or compete with regional authority. Interpretively, the 3rd century crisis demonstrates how decentralization under military pressure undermined the cohesion of imperial institutions. Economic strain compounded political instability. Continuous military campaigns, repeated elevation of new emperors, and widespread pillaging disrupted trade networks, reduced agricultural output, and strained the treasury. Numismatic evidence shows significant debasement of coinage during this period, indicating inflation and reduced public confidence in imperial finance. Papyri from Egypt record delays in tax collection and local economic hardship, illustrating the systemic impact of political volatility on fiscal administration. Frontier collapse was another defining feature. Germanic tribes, Sarmatians, and Gothic groups exploited imperial weakness, conducting raids along the Rhine and Danube. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence reveal abandoned forts, hastily reconstructed walls, and increased fortifications in strategic zones. Eastern frontiers faced pressure from the Sassanid Empire, with repeated incursions along Mesopotamia and Armenia. These external pressures exposed the limits of a military system overextended by internal divisions and insufficient logistical coordination. The frequent elevation of military emperors had structural consequences. Armies loyal to regional commanders operated semi-autonomously, often prioritizing immediate rewards over strategic imperial cohesion. Epigraphic evidence documents donatives, land grants, and localized provisioning, showing how loyalty was transactional and contingent. This system amplified instability, as competing claimants could rapidly mobilize forces to challenge the central authority. Administrative adaptation struggled to keep pace. Governors and civic officials attempted to maintain tax collection, legal order, and infrastructure amid rapid turnover of emperors and shifting provincial allegiance. Inscriptions reveal sporadic enforcement of laws and local decrees issued independently of central authority. These disruptions highlight the vulnerability of bureaucratic structures when legitimacy is constantly contested and regional military power dominates. Interpretively, the 3rd century crisis reveals that structural stability requires predictable succession, coordinated military command, and resilient fiscal and administrative institutions. When these elements are compromised, even the most developed systems are prone to fragmentation. The Roman experience demonstrates the interdependence of military, political, and economic structures. Failure in one domain cascades across the entire imperial framework. A second analytical insight concerns the feedback loop between military dependence and economic strain. The need to secure loyalty through donatives, expanded pay, and logistical support intensified fiscal pressure, contributing to inflation, resource depletion, and erosion of state capacity. Archaeological and numismatic evidence shows that these pressures compounded over decades, illustrating how short-term tactical solutions generated long-term systemic vulnerabilities. By 284 CE, the empire remained formally unified, but the cumulative effects of rapid succession, fiscal strain, frontier collapse, and regional militarization demanded comprehensive reform. The internal and external pressures of the 3rd century demonstrated that incremental adjustments were insufficient to restore stability. Reform became unavoidable. The empire adapted to survive. Diocletian's ascension in 284 CE marked a deliberate restructuring of imperial authority, transforming Rome's centralized system into a managed, multi-tiered governance designed to address the structural crises of the 3rd century. Diocletian inherited an empire destabilized by rapid succession, economic turmoil, and fractured frontiers. Literary sources, including Lactantius and the Historia Augusta, emphasize the systematic nature of his reforms, which sought to restore order through institutional innovation rather than relying solely on military coercion. Archaeological evidence, including administrative inscriptions, road networks, and fortified urban centers, illustrates the material implementation of these reforms. Central to Diocletian's strategy was the creation of the Tetrarchy in 293 CE. Authority was divided among 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars, each responsible for a distinct territorial sector. Inscriptions and coinage commemorate the arrangement, reflecting both administrative hierarchy and ideological messaging. This division aimed to improve frontier defense, enhance bureaucratic supervision, and ensure smoother succession, addressing vulnerabilities exposed during the 3rd century crises. Administrative restructuring accompanied territorial division. Provinces were subdivided, with governors reporting to regional vicars who in turn coordinated with the Caesars and Augusti. Epigraphic evidence confirms the creation of dioceses and the appointment of officials tasked with fiscal, judicial, and military oversight. By decentralizing day-to-day management while preserving ultimate authority in the imperial collegium, Diocletian strengthened the operational capacity of the state while mitigating risks associated with overly concentrated personal power. Economic restructuring complemented administrative reform. Diocletian introduced the annona militaris, ensuring consistent provisioning of troops, and implemented price edicts to stabilize urban markets, as recorded in inscriptions and surviving papyri. Coinage reforms and tax standardization attempted to counter inflation caused by 3rd century debasement. While these measures had mixed success, they reflect a systematic attempt to link administrative efficiency, military logistics, and fiscal stability. The Tetrarchy also relied on ideological reinforcement. Emperors were presented as divinely sanctioned, adopting ceremonial dress, titulature, and protocols that emphasize their authority above traditional civic structures. Inscriptions, monumental arches, and coinage depict the Augusti and Caesars as embodiments of imperial unity and order, communicating stability both to elites and provincial populations. Interpretively, the fusion of ideology and administration reinforced legitimacy during a period in which military coercion alone had proven insufficient. Military authority was integrated into the administrative hierarchy. Each emperor controlled frontier forces within their territorial assignment, coordinating recruitment, fortification, and deployment. Archaeological evidence from Rhine, Danube, and eastern frontiers confirms reconstruction of forts, watchtowers, and supply depots. These measures institutionalized defensive readiness, emphasizing sustainability over offensive expansion, consistent with the Tetrarchic philosophy of managed stability. Interpretively, the Tetrarchy demonstrates how systemic crises can prompt structural innovation. By formalizing succession, subdividing governance, and integrating military, fiscal, and legal administration under regional oversight, Diocletian addressed the vulnerabilities that had plagued the 3rd century. Authority no longer depended on personal charisma or temporary loyalty. It became a function of coordinated institutional frameworks. A second insight concerns the interaction between administrative division and imperial cohesion. Although power was geographically dispersed, ideological reinforcement, through ceremonies, titulature, and shared coinage, maintained the perception of a unified empire. Epigraphic evidence shows consistent messaging across dioceses, suggesting that institutional authority and symbolic communication were mutually reinforcing mechanisms in sustaining imperial legitimacy. By 305 CE, the Tetrarchic system had stabilized succession, improved frontier security, and professionalized administration. While complex and resource-intensive, the arrangement demonstrated the empire's capacity for adaptive governance in response to structural stressors. Central authority required ideological reinforcement. Unity was enforced, not assumed. Diocletian's religious policies illustrate how the imperial state sought cohesion through controlled orthodoxy, demonstrating that ideological conformity was considered essential to sustaining authority during structural transformation. Diocletian's reign coincided with a period of administrative centralization and systemic reform, yet the empire's cohesion remained contingent on loyalty and ideological alignment. Literary sources, including Lactantius and Eusebius, document the issuance of imperial edicts targeting Christian communities, marking the most systematic persecution in Roman history. These measures, collectively referred to as the Diocletianic or Great Persecution, 303 to 311 CE, aimed to enforce public adherence to traditional Roman cults, projecting imperial authority through religious conformity. The policy included the destruction of Christian scriptures and places of worship, suspension of Christian civic rights, and arrest of clerics and community leaders. Archaeological evidence from destroyed basilicas, repurposed religious sites, and epigraphic records of confiscations corroborates the enforcement of these edicts across multiple provinces. By subordinating religious practice to state oversight, the regime sought to integrate ideological control into its broader administrative and military apparatus. The rationale behind persecution extended beyond doctrinal enforcement. Inscriptions and legal fragments suggest that adherence to traditional cults was linked to civic duty and loyalty to the emperor. Participation in public sacrifice and ritual observances was a visible expression of obedience, reinforcing political and social cohesion. Interpretively, this policy reflects a governance philosophy in which ideological conformity was inseparable from institutional stability. Military and provincial authorities played a central role in implementing these measures. Governors and provincial magistrates were responsible for monitoring adherence, prosecuting violations, and coordinating confiscations. Epigraphic records from Asia Minor, North Africa, and the Western provinces indicate systematic enforcement, demonstrating that religious policy was operationalized through the same hierarchical structures designed for fiscal, legal, and military administration. Despite the rigor of these policies, enforcement was uneven. Geographic distance, local elite sympathies, and logistical challenges meant that some regions experienced limited persecution, while others underwent severe enforcement. Archaeological evidence of surviving Christian communities and repaired religious infrastructure suggests resilience and adaptation, highlighting the limitations of top-down ideological control in a diverse and expansive empire. The persecution also illustrates the link between ideology and imperial legitimacy. By framing obedience to traditional religious practices as loyalty to the emperor, Diocletian reinforced the moral and symbolic authority of the state. Coinage, monumental inscriptions, and ceremonial architecture emphasized continuity with Rome's religious heritage, projecting stability while legitimizing the hierarchical reforms of the Tetrarchy. Interpretively, the Great Persecution demonstrates a structural principle. Political authority in a complex, multi-ethnic empire requires mechanisms, administrative, symbolic, and coercive, to maintain cohesion. Religious conformity was leveraged as a tool to unify disparate provinces and populations under centralized governance. Yet the uneven impact of enforcement also highlights the practical limitations of ideological control when confronted with entrenched social and cultural diversity. A second insight concerns the relationship between crisis and policy radicalization. Diocletian's focus on religious orthodoxy intensified during a period of structural consolidation, illustrating a broader pattern in which regimes facing systemic uncertainty may resort to ideological enforcement as a means of stabilizing authority. This underscores the interplay between institutional reform, military oversight, and social policy in sustaining imperial governance. By 311 CE, the death of Galerius and subsequent shifts in policy would begin to reverse the religious persecution, highlighting the contingency of ideological enforcement and the adaptive pressures facing even a centralized, reformed state. Religious policy would soon reverse direction. Imperial power realigned with belief. Constantine's ascent transformed Roman authority by linking political legitimacy to religious affiliation, reshaping governance, military strategy, and imperial identity in ways that reverberated across the empire. Constantine rose to power amid continued fragmentation following Diocletian's abdication, and the subsequent civil wars among tetrarchic successors. Literary sources, including Lactantius, Eusebius Vita Constantini, and Zosimus, document his military campaigns and political maneuvering from 306 to 324 CE. Epigraphic and numismatic evidence confirms his gradual consolidation. As coinage proclaimed his authority and inscriptions commemorated victories, administrative appointments, and territorial control. Military consolidation was central to Constantine's authority. Following his elevation in Britain in 306 CE, Constantine secured loyalty from key legions across Gaul, the Rhine, and Danube regions. Archaeological evidence, including fortified camps, supply depots, and inscriptions honoring legions, indicates systematic reorganization of frontier defense. He combined disciplined deployment with strategic rewards for officers and troops, stabilizing military loyalty while expanding operational reach. This ensured that his authority rested on organized, professionalized forces rather than ad hoc factional support. Administrative reforms complemented military consolidation. Constantine continued Diocletianic practices of provincial subdivision, introducing additional bureaucratic oversight to ensure uniform governance. Provincial governors and military commanders were subordinated to centralized fiscal and judicial structures. Inscriptions and papyri from Gaul, the eastern provinces, and Egypt document new appointments, tax standardization, and legal edicts, demonstrating the integration of administrative and military authority under a single imperial framework. Symbolically, Constantine reinforced legitimacy through ideological innovation. Coinage, monuments, and inscriptions increasingly emphasized divine sanction, incorporating Christian symbols such as the Chi Rho after 312 CE. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge, traditionally dated to 312 CE, became a defining moment in aligning political authority with Christian endorsement. Sources suggest that Constantine publicly framed his victory as divinely guided, legitimizing his consolidation and projecting ideological coherence across the empire. Interpretively, this represents a deliberate realignment of political and religious authority, embedding ideological legitimacy into systemic governance. Urban and architectural reform also reflected Constantine's strategic priorities. The founding of Constantinople in 330 CE as a new eastern capital represented both defensive foresight and symbolic projection of imperial authority. Archaeological surveys, including fortifications, public buildings, and urban infrastructure, demonstrate careful planning, integration of military, administrative, and religious functions, and the creation of a new center capable of supporting long-term governance. Constantinople's construction institutionalized a dual capital system, reflecting the empire's geographic and administrative complexity. Fiscal policy adapted to these structural and ideological reforms. Resources were allocated to support both military campaigns and urban development, including Constantinople, and to integrate religious institutions into state administration. Papyri and inscriptions document taxation for construction, salaries for officials, and logistical support for frontier and civic projects. This integration reinforced the operational capacity of the empire while embedding the new ideological framework within fiscal practice. Interpretively, Constantine's rise illustrates the intersection of military, administrative, and ideological systems in sustaining authority. Military loyalty ensured operational stability, administrative reform provided predictability and legal coherence, and religious alignment strengthened legitimacy. These elements were mutually reinforcing, demonstrating that imperial power in the early 4th century depended on systemic integration rather than individual charisma alone. A second analytical insight concerns succession and institutional precedent. Constantine established a model in which dynastic authority, military command, and religious endorsement were interdependent. Epigraphic evidence and coinage confirm that his sons were elevated to positions of authority with overlapping administrative and military responsibilities, reinforcing continuity and signaling legitimacy to both elites and provincial populations. This approach institutionalized succession while balancing symbolic and structural authority. By 324 CE, Constantine had defeated Licinius, consolidated control over the entire Roman Empire, and established Constantinople as a new center of political, military, and ideological power. The integration of Christian belief into the imperial framework fundamentally reshaped governance, signaling a decisive shift in the relationship between state authority, religion, and administrative structure. Religion reshaped imperial identity. Faith became imperial infrastructure. Under Constantine, Christianity transitioned from a persecuted sect to an integrated pillar of state authority, shaping legal structures, administrative priorities, and the ideological foundations of the Roman Empire. Following his consolidation of power, Constantine actively promoted Christianity through legal, fiscal, and institutional measures. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE had already granted tolerance to Christians, but by the mid-320s, imperial policy extended further, providing patronage for churches, clergy, and ecclesiastical administration. Archaeological evidence, including basilicas in Rome, Constantinople, and provincial cities, corroborates state-sponsored construction, while inscriptions record donations, endowments, and privileges granted to Christian leaders. Legal integration of Christianity was a core element of Constantine's reforms. Edicts and imperial letters, preserved in codices and collected in the Codex Theodosianus, granted Christians exemption from certain civic duties, recognized ecclesiastical courts, and formalized the Church's role in social services. These measures effectively embedded religious institutions within the administrative apparatus, creating parallel legal authority under imperial oversight. Interpretively, this integration demonstrates how ideological legitimacy became inseparable from governance structures. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE exemplifies Constantine's use of ecclesiastical organization to reinforce political authority. Convened to resolve doctrinal disputes and unify Christian practice, the council also served as a mechanism for imperial influence over religious hierarchy. Contemporary sources and episcopal correspondence indicate that decisions on orthodoxy were communicated across provinces, linking theological conformity with civic stability. By coordinating doctrine through state-sanctioned councils, Constantine strengthened the perception of centralized, cohesive authority. Fiscal and material support reinforced institutional integration. Inscriptions and papyri document imperial grants of land, revenue, and resources to bishops, monastic communities, and urban clergy. These provisions institutionalized Christian leadership within the empire's economic and administrative frameworks, ensuring both loyalty and operational capacity for civic services, including education, charity, and urban maintenance. This arrangement mirrored existing bureaucratic structures, demonstrating the adaptability of imperial governance to new ideological priorities. Christianity also influenced urban planning and civic space. The construction of basilicas, episcopal residences, and charitable institutions reshaped the urban landscape, integrating religious function into administrative and social frameworks. Archaeological surveys of Constantinople, Antioch, and Rome reveal coordinated building programs emphasizing accessibility, civic visibility, and strategic placement, highlighting the integration of faith into the operational and symbolic infrastructure of the state. Interpretively, Constantine's integration of Christianity illustrates the reciprocal relationship between ideology and administration. Religious institutions gained protection, resources, and formal authority, while the state acquired legitimacy, social cohesion, and a mechanism for ideological communication across diverse populations. This alignment reinforced stability, institutionalized succession, and provided a durable framework for imperial governance that extended beyond the emperor's personal reign. A second analytical insight concerns legal pluralism. By embedding ecclesiastical courts within imperial jurisdiction, Constantine introduced a dual system in which civil and religious authority coexisted. Inscriptions, legal codices, and correspondence between provincial governors and bishops show that Christian courts handled property disputes, contractual enforcement, and disciplinary matters. This integration demonstrates how ideological alignment can be operationalized to support state capacity and reinforce structural governance. By 337 CE, at Constantine's death, Christianity was no longer marginal but functionally integrated into the imperial framework. Clerical hierarchy, legal privileges, fiscal support, and urban infrastructure collectively reflected the transformation of faith into an essential component of state administration. The emperor's policies set a precedent for the enduring association between religious authority and political legitimacy in the Roman Empire. Transformation altered Rome permanently. Survival differed by region. In the centuries following Constantine, the Roman Empire's administrative cohesion became increasingly uneven, with Western provinces experiencing decline while the Eastern Empire maintained continuity, illustrating the differentiated impact of structural pressures. After Constantine's death in 337 CE, the empire was divided among his sons, establishing a precedent of regionalized rule that would define the late Roman period. Literary sources, including Ammianus Marcellinus and Zosimus, document repeated subdivisions, contested succession, and civil conflict. Archaeological evidence, such as inscriptions, fortifications, and urban decline in the West, confirms that the practical exercise of imperial authority varied significantly between regions. Administrative continuity persisted in the East, where Constantinople served as a resilient center of governance, while the West faced increasingly fragmented authority. Military pressures exacerbated regional differentiation. Germanic migrations, internal revolts, and Hunnic incursions challenged frontier stability, particularly in Gaul, Italy, and Hispania. Archaeological surveys indicate abandoned forts, hastily reinforced urban defenses, and repeated relocation of administrative centers. These disruptions reflect the limits of a military system stretched across vast and contested borders, highlighting structural vulnerabilities that were less acute in the East due to denser urban networks and centralized command. Economic strain compounded fragmentation. The Western provinces faced reduced agricultural output, disrupted trade, and increasing reliance on local elites to maintain fiscal operations. Numismatic evidence shows continued debasement of coinage and regional variation in monetary circulation. Papyri from North Africa and Gaul document delayed tax collection and localized resource management, emphasizing that fiscal resilience depended on regional capacity rather than uniform imperial oversight. Administrative division became both a response and a structural challenge. The empire was formally partitioned into eastern and western halves, with further subdivision into dioceses and provinces. Inscriptions and legal codices confirm that each region maintained separate bureaucracies, judicial authorities, and military commands. While this division allowed more manageable governance, it also entrenched disparities in capacity, with the East retaining institutional sophistication while the West increasingly relied on local magnates and mercenary forces. Political instability persisted in the West. Successive emperors, including Valentinian III and Romulus Augustulus, struggled to assert authority over rebellious generals, Gothic federates, and regional governors. Literary accounts document repeated deposition, usurpation, and negotiation with external powers. The frequency of these events illustrates that legitimacy was contingent on military control and elite alignment rather than legal or dynastic continuity alone. Interpretively, the late Roman Empire demonstrates how administrative division can preserve stability in one region while contributing to decline in another. Structural resilience in the East, supported by urban density, fiscal capacity, and centralized military coordination, contrasts sharply with the fragmented Western provinces, where local authority, external pressure, and resource scarcity undermine systemic cohesion. This differentiation highlights the contingent nature of imperial survival under systemic stress. A second analytical insight concerns the interaction between military reliance and governance. In the West, the increasing dependence on foederati and mercenary contingents provided short-term security but eroded long-term institutional stability. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence indicates that these forces often operated semi-autonomously, challenging centralized command and undermining administrative predictability. By contrast, the East maintained disciplined legions and provincial oversight, illustrating the importance of integrated military administrative structures for resilience. By 476 CE, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus marked the effective end of Western imperial authority, though Eastern structures persisted as the Byzantine Empire. The contrast between the two regions underscores how survival depended not solely on ideology or tradition, but on the robustness of administrative, military, and fiscal systems capable of responding to sustained structural pressures. Legacy extended beyond political collapse. Greatness in Rome was institutional, not personal. Across the empire's history, emperors who combined administrative competence, military oversight, and structural foresight left enduring legacies, while those relying solely on charisma or spectacle often precipitated instability. The evaluation of imperial effectiveness requires analysis beyond anecdotal or moralistic judgment. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio, Tacitus, Herodian, and Ammianus Marcellinus, provide narrative accounts of emperors' actions, but archaeological evidence, inscriptions, coinage, and urban infrastructure reveal patterns of systemic governance. These sources allow scholars to differentiate between rulers whose policies reinforced imperial stability and those whose focus on personal authority or symbolic representation undermined institutional resilience. A key factor in greatness was administrative competence. Emperors such as Augustus, Trajan, and Diocletian established legal frameworks, provincial oversight, and bureaucratic structures that facilitated continuity and adaptability. Inscriptions documenting provincial appointments, papyri detailing tax and legal procedures, and monumental building projects demonstrate the ability of these rulers to translate policy into operational effectiveness. Interpretively, institutionalized governance ensured that authority was sustainable and less dependent on individual personality. Military management was equally critical. Effective emperors maintained disciplined, professionalized forces while integrating them into broader administrative systems. For example, Septimius Severus emphasized military loyalty through pay and logistical support, while Constantine reorganized frontier forces and fortified strategic locations. Archaeological surveys of forts, legionary inscriptions, and supply infrastructure corroborate the correlation between organized military oversight and imperial stability. Conversely, emperors who neglected or mismanaged the army, such as Commodus or the rapid succession of third-century claimants, often precipitated crises. Economic policy and fiscal prudence were additional determinants. Sustainable taxation, currency stabilization, and infrastructure investment provided the resources necessary for governance and defense. Numismatic evidence, fiscal papyri, and records of construction programs reveal that emperors who balanced expenditure with resource management enhanced resilience. Excessive personal spending or misallocation of funds, in contrast, increased vulnerability, as seen during the reigns of Commodus or the late 3rd century soldier emperors. Ideological and religious policy contributed indirectly to imperial effectiveness. Augustus' use of traditional cults, Diocletian's enforced orthodoxy, and Constantine's integration of Christianity demonstrate that legitimacy required alignment between governance structures and social cohesion. While ideology alone did not guarantee stability, it functioned as a mechanism to unify elites, provincial populations, and military forces, reinforcing institutional authority. Interpretively, the distinction between reputation and structural competence is essential. Emperors celebrated in literary or popular memory were not always the most effective administrators, while less renowned rulers sometimes implemented policies that preserved the empire's integrity. Archaeological and documentary evidence allows modern scholarship to assess performance through measurable outcomes: administrative continuity, military stability, fiscal health, and territorial security, rather than anecdotal perception. A second analytical insight concerns succession planning. Emperors who established predictable mechanisms for transfer of authority, through adoption, co-regency, or dynastic elevation, reduced the likelihood of civil war and institutional collapse. Augustus' Principate, the Nerva Antonine adoptive model, and Diocletian's Tetrarchy illustrate that foresight in succession strengthened resilience, whereas neglect or reliance on personal loyalty, as with Commodus or many 3rd century rulers, amplified instability. Finally, infrastructure and urban development offer tangible measures of imperial greatness. Construction of roads, aqueducts, fortifications, and administrative centers not only enhanced practical governance but also symbolized the integration of imperial authority into daily life. Epigraphic evidence, archaeological surveys, and coinage inscriptions collectively document how these projects reflected operational capacity and long-term vision. In synthesis, a great Roman emperor combined administrative skill, military oversight, fiscal management, and strategic ideological alignment. Individual charisma or popularity was insufficient. Enduring legacies emerged from structural effectiveness and the capacity to adapt institutions to systemic pressures. Evidence across archaeological, epigraphic, and literary sources confirms that institutional competence, not personal legend, was the principal determinant of imperial success. By the end of the Western Empire in 476 CE, this distinction became stark. Some emperors' reputations endured while their structural policies failed, whereas the most effective rulers, Augustus, Trajan, Diocletian, Constantine, left systems, infrastructure, and legal frameworks that influenced governance for centuries. If you found this exploration of Rome's greatest emperors insightful, subscribe to Nightfall History for more deeply researched, chronologically precise documentaries. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on new episodes and dive further into the rise, fall, and legacy of civilizations that shaped our world. Settle in, explore the past with clarity, and let history illuminate the structures that endure beyond time.